When archivists opened the leather-bound plantation ledger in a climate-controlled vault, they expected routine entries, cotton yields, expenses, weather patterns. What they found instead was a column of dates spanning 18 years, each marked with a single initial, S, and beside it, descriptions that grew increasingly desperate. Light as cream, read one. Blue-eyed, passed inspection, noted another. Sold north, no questions asked, stated a third. 18 entries, 18 children. One woman's name appeared nowhere in the official records, but her shadow stretched across every page. The last entry, written in a different hand, shaking perhaps or hurried, read simply, "Burned it all. God forgive me." The question historians would spend decades trying to answer wasn't if these children existed. The plantation's financial records confirmed payments, travel arrangements, falsified documents. The question was, why did someone try so desperately to erase her from history, and why did they ultimately fail? The Hartley Plantation in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, sprawled across 1,200 acres of rolling Piedmont land, bisected by a sluggish creek that flooded every spring and dried to a trickle by August. The property had been in the Hartley family since 1768, when Robert's great-grandfather purchased it with money earned through shipping contracts during the colonial period. 3 generations had worked this land, each expanding operations, adding buildings, acquiring more workers to tend the tobacco fields that represented the family's primary income. By 1830, the plantation operated as a small village unto itself. The main house stood at the property's highest point, a 3-story Georgian structure with white columns and 12 rooms, surrounded by formal gardens that required constant maintenance. Behind it, the kitchen building stood separate to reduce fire risk, connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Further back were the smokehouse, the dairy, the laundry building, the weaving house, and the carpentry shop. Beyond these structures stretched 2 long rows of cabins, 20 in total, that housed the plantation's enslaved workforce. 214 people lived and worked on Hartley land in 1830. Of these, 12 were white. The Hartley family, the overseer and his wife, a tutor for the Hartley children, and several hired craftsmen who lived in quarters near the workshops. The remaining 202 were enslaved, ranging from infants to elderly individuals in their 70s, all categorized in the plantation ledgers by age, gender, skill, and assigned value. The system functioned with mechanical precision. Dawn bells rang at 4:30 during planting and harvest seasons, 5:30 otherwise. Field gangs assembled by 5:15, tools distributed, work assignments given. The day's labor continued until dusk, with a brief midday break for the noon meal. House servants followed different schedules, waking earlier to prepare breakfast for the family, working later to serve dinner and clean up afterward. Children under 10 stayed in a nursery area, supervised by elderly women too frail for field work. Those over 10 began learning trades or joining lighter work gangs, gradually building toward full adult labor by age 14. Robert Hartley III, called Young Robert until his father's stroke made him simply Robert, had been groomed for this inheritance since birth. His father, Robert II, believed in proper education for plantation management. Young Robert spent his childhood learning the basics: crop rotation, soil management, market timing, labor allocation. At 16, he was sent to Richmond to study law, not because the family expected him to practice, but because legal knowledge was essential for protecting property and navigating increasingly complex regulations around slavery, debt, and inheritance. Richmond in the 1820s was a city of contrasts. The state capital housed impressive government buildings and wealthy merchants' homes, but also slave auction houses and crowded docks, where tobacco and human cargo departed for distant markets. Young Robert lodged with his mother's cousin, a prosperous attorney, and attended classes at a private academy while apprenticing at a law office. He was meant to learn discipline, professional conduct, and the networks that would serve him when he returned to manage family affairs. Instead, he discovered gambling, drinking, and the city's less reputable establishments. His allowance, generous by plantation standards, evaporated in card games and horse races. He borrowed from classmates, then from merchants, then from professional money lenders who charged ruinous interest. By his third year in Richmond, at age 21, he owed over $2,000 to various creditors, a sum that would take his father years to repay, even if tobacco prices remained strong. Robert II knew nothing of this. His son's letters home were cheerful and vague, mentioning studies and social engagements but never finances. The cousin who was supposed to supervise the young man was too busy with his own practice to notice, or perhaps too diplomatic to report the mounting problems. Robert II continued sending quarterly allowances and planning for his son's eventual return to take over plantation operations. Then, in February 1832, Robert II suffered a massive stroke while reviewing accounts in his study. The overseer found him slumped over his desk, the left side of his body paralyzed, unable to speak beyond garbled sounds. The doctor, summoned from Fredericksburg, a 2-hour carriage ride, confirmed the severity. The elder Hartley might live for years, the doctor explained, but he would never walk independently again, never speak clearly, never manage complex affairs. The plantation needed new leadership immediately. Young Robert received the urgent letter in Richmond and experienced simultaneous emotions: grief for his father's condition and relief that the crisis would force his creditors to wait. A son returning home to manage family affairs during emergency couldn't be dunned for debts, not immediately. It bought him time to find solutions before the money lenders could pursue legal action that would expose his financial recklessness to his family. He arrived home in March 1832, accompanied by his new wife. Margaret Ashworth had seemed like Providence when Robert met her at a Richmond social function 6 months earlier. She was 17, recently graduated from a Philadelphia finishing school, visiting Richmond relatives for the season. More importantly, she was an heiress. Her father, a Charleston merchant who died the previous year, had left her a substantial dowry, $8,000 in cash and partial ownership of a Carolina rice plantation that generated annual income. Robert courted her with desperate intensity, seeing in this shy, educated girl the solution to all his problems. Her relatives, distant cousins serving as guardians, were flattered by attention from an established Virginia family and saw no reason to investigate the Hartley finances too closely. The tobacco plantation was real, the family name respectable. They approved the match. Margaret accepted his proposal because she was 17, away from home, and taught that marriage to a landed gentleman represented appropriate feminine success. Robert seemed charming enough during their brief courtship, attentive, educated, from the same social class. She didn't love him, but love wasn't required for a successful marriage. Compatibility and financial security mattered more, her guardians assured her. They married in January 1832, a small ceremony in Richmond. Margaret's dowry transferred to Robert's control immediately, as law required. He paid off his most urgent debts, settled accounts that were approaching legal action, and still had enough remaining to relieve some pressure on the plantation's finances. When his father's stroke occurred weeks later, it almost seemed, some neighbors would later whisper, remarkably convenient timing. Margaret arrived at her new home in March to discover a situation nothing like what she'd imagined. The Philadelphia finishing school had taught her French, piano, needlework, and appropriate conversation for social occasions. It had not prepared her for a Virginia plantation's realities: the casual brutality of the labor system, the isolation from urban society, the suffocating hierarchy that governed every interaction, or the sight of human beings worked like draft animals under threat of the lash. Her first week, she witnessed the overseer punishing a field hand who'd worked too slowly during tobacco planting. The man was stripped and whipped in the yard, where everyone could see, a routine enforcement of discipline. Margaret, watching from an upstairs window, vomited into a chamber pot and spent the rest of the day locked in her room, weeping. Robert found her there that evening, annoyed by her absence at dinner, and explained with patient condescension that she simply needed to adjust to country life. The workers required firm management, he told her. She'd understand once she settled in. She didn't understand, but she learned to look away. Her education had prepared her for this too: how to maintain appropriate appearances, how to ignore unpleasant realities, how to focus on the narrow sphere of household management and social obligations while leaving the broader world to men's control. The household staff consisted of 12 people who worked exclusively in and around the main house. A cook, 2 kitchen assistants, a butler, 3 maids, 2 laundry women, a lady's maid for Margaret, a manservant for Robert, and a boy who tended fires and carried messages. Additional workers came from the fields as needed for heavy cleaning or repairs, but these 12 formed the core domestic staff, sleeping in quarters attached to the kitchen building and the laundry house. Among them was a young woman Margaret's age, 18 when Margaret arrived. The plantation ledgers from that period recorded her only by category and assigned value. House servant, female, age 18, mulatto, value $600, purchased 1828 from estate sale, Maryland origin. Her skills included cleaning, cooking, needlework, and basic literacy, the last unusual and technically illegal to teach, but valuable for household management since she could read recipes and written instructions. In the careful social hierarchy of plantation life, she occupied a specific position. House servant rather than field worker, young and relatively attractive, light-skinned enough to work in the main house where masters preferred servants who didn't remind them too overtly of slavery's racial foundations. These factors made her simultaneously more valued and more vulnerable than many others on the plantation. Margaret's lady's maid, an older woman named Patience, brought from Charleston as part of Margaret's dowry, noticed this immediately. Patience had worked in wealthy households her entire life and understood the patterns. Within a week of arrival, she'd quietly advised Margaret to keep the younger servants busy with tasks that kept them visible and occupied, never isolated where Robert might encounter them alone. Margaret, naive about such matters, didn't fully understand the warning, but followed the advice because Patience had been her mother's servant and knew more about household management than Margaret did. For 2 years, the plantation operated smoothly. Robert managed the business side, negotiating tobacco sales, maintaining credit relationships with Richmond merchants, overseeing the overseer who supervised daily field operations. Margaret ran the household, planned meals, managed the domestic servants, handled the social obligations that plantation ownership required. They attended Sunday services at the local Episcopal church, hosted occasional dinners for neighboring planters, maintained the appearances of a successful young couple. They weren't happy exactly. Robert found Margaret boring. She had no conversation beyond domestic trivia and remained squeamish about plantation realities. Margaret found Robert coarse and increasingly distant, spending long evenings in his study drinking whiskey and reviewing accounts. But happiness wasn't the goal. Functionality was what mattered, and the marriage functioned adequately. Until the spring of 1834, when everything began to unravel. Margaret missed her monthly courses in March. By April, she was certain she was pregnant. The realization brought conflicting emotions. She'd been taught that bearing children represented a woman's primary duty and that motherhood would bring fulfillment. She'd also watched her own mother die from complications of her 6th pregnancy, a memory that haunted her dreams. The doctor, Dr. Hammond, who traveled a circuit among the county's plantations, confirmed the pregnancy during his monthly visit in early May. He prescribed the standard recommendations: moderate exercise, avoidance of excitement, bland foods to counter morning sickness, and complete abstinence from marital relations after the 5th month. Margaret followed his instructions obsessively, terrified of miscarriage or complications. Robert received the news with satisfaction. An heir would secure his social position, provide collateral for future loans, and fulfill family expectations that had weighed on him since his father's stroke. He announced the pregnancy to neighboring planters and began planning nursery renovations. The upper floor's southwest corner room, largest and brightest, would be converted to a nursery suite with an adjoining room for a wet nurse and nursemaid. The household reorganized around Margaret's pregnancy. Her workload was reduced to almost nothing. Patience and 2 other maids attended her constantly, bringing meals to her room when morning sickness made her unable to face the dining room, helping her with the increasingly complex dressing procedures required by maternity fashion, reading to her during the long afternoon hours when she was forbidden from exertion. May passed peacefully. Margaret's morning sickness eased slightly, and she felt well enough to take short walks in the garden. June arrived hot and humid, as Virginia summers always were, and she retreated to her darkened bedroom where servants fanned her and brought cool drinks. Dr. Hammond visited mid-June and pronounced everything progressing normally. The baby was due in late December, a Christmas blessing. 3 days after Dr. Hammond's visit, Margaret woke at midnight with agonizing cramps. The bed was soaked with blood. She screamed for patients, who came running, took one look, and sent the manservant sprinting for the doctor. By the time Dr. Hammond arrived 2 hours later, Margaret was hemorrhaging dangerously, barely conscious from blood loss and shock. He worked through the night, doing what little medical science of the 1830s could do. Ergot preparations to encourage the uterus to contract, pressure to slow bleeding, prayer that her body would recover. The miscarriage completed itself by dawn, the barely formed fetus expelled along with dangerous amounts of blood. Margaret survived, but Dr. Hammond's prognosis was grim. He explained to Robert, Margaret was too sedated with laudanum to understand, that the miscarriage had caused severe internal damage. Scarring and tearing meant future pregnancies were unlikely, and if conception did occur, carrying to term was improbable. Attempting pregnancy again could kill her. He recommended they consider themselves fortunate she'd survived and accept childlessness as God's will. Robert listened to this explanation in his study, Dr. Hammond's voice sympathetic but clinical, and felt his world contract. No heir meant no security. His father, still alive but utterly incapacitated, would die eventually, and Robert would inherit everything, but without sons to pass property to, his position was precarious. Creditors knew childless men were poor risks for long-term loans. Business partners questioned whether someone without heirs would maintain property properly or might simply liquidate assets for immediate pleasure. Worse, the plantation's finances were deteriorating. Tobacco prices had dropped steadily for 3 years. The previous season's harvest had barely covered operating costs. Robert needed capital for improvements, new equipment, drainage projects, possibly transitioning some acreage to different crops. Banks might loan to a man with an heir and stable family prospects. They wouldn't loan to a childless planter with a sickly wife and declining revenues. He sat in his study that night after Dr. Hammond departed, reviewing ledgers by lamplight, drinking his way through a bottle of his father's best whiskey. The numbers didn't improve with alcohol, but the desperation became more manageable, transforming from panic into cold calculation. There had to be a solution. There was always a solution if you were willing to cross certain boundaries. Margaret recovered slowly, spending weeks in her darkened room, heavily dosed with laudanum for pain and anxiety. The medication became a habit, then a dependency. Even after the physical healing completed, she continued requesting the medicine for her nerves, and Dr. Hammond, believing emotional stability important for a woman who'd suffered such trauma, continued prescribing it. She began spending most of each day in a peaceful haze, reading novels, napping, occasionally venturing downstairs for meals, but mostly isolated in her rooms with patients as constant companion. Robert let her retreat into laudanum and isolation. A wife who stayed in her rooms made certain things easier. He'd noticed the young house servant months earlier, of course. You noticed attractive servants the way you noticed well-made furniture, as pleasant features of your environment. He'd had no particular designs on her. His father had taught him that reckless behavior with the household stuff created unnecessary complications. Better to visit establishments in Fredericksburg when needs arose, keeping business and pleasure properly separated. But circumstances had changed. His wife was now an invalid, his financial situation was desperate, and he needed an heir by whatever means necessary. The solution that occurred to him, gradually at first, then with increasing clarity as he considered the implications, was both simple and monstrous. She was property. He owned her labor, her time, her body, in the same sense he owned livestock. More importantly, she had the right physical characteristics. Light skin, European features, the ancestry that produced children who might pass inspection if needed. If she bore his child, which biology made entirely possible, that child would likely look white enough to be placed into white society. No one questioned where orphanage babies came from. Childless families desperate for heirs didn't investigate too closely when presented with healthy infants of appropriate appearance. He could solve two problems simultaneously: his need for an heir and his financial pressures. Wealthy families paid well for babies they could present as adopted orphans, children to inherit their estates and carry forward their names. He wouldn't keep the children himself. That would be too risky, too complicated. But he could create them, ensure they had the right appearance, and find appropriate placements for substantial payments. It was reprehensible. It was also practical. And Robert had spent enough time in Richmond's shadier establishments to know that worse things happened regularly without consequence. The trick was maintaining discretion and proper documentation. He began planning in July 1834, still mourning the loss of his legitimate heir, already calculating how to implement this alternative. First, he needed contacts in Richmond who handled delicate adoptions. Second, he needed to ensure the woman's cooperation, or at least compliance. Third, he needed systems for keeping records without creating evidence that could expose him. By August, he'd made inquiries through carefully worded letters to certain Richmond lawyers who specialized in estate matters and adoption arrangements. He learned that, yes, discreet placements could be arranged for infants of appropriate background. The foundling homes asked few questions when babies arrived with substantial donations. Families seeking children were numerous, especially those who'd struggled with infertility or lost children to disease. A healthy white infant was valuable. The woman herself became part of his planning. He reassigned her from Margaret's direct service, where patients watched everything, to more general household tasks: cleaning, laundry, kitchen assistance, whatever kept her busy but not particularly visible. Margaret, sedated and detached, didn't notice or care about staffing changes. Patients noticed but interpreted it as Robert being considerate, removing the young woman from direct contact with Margaret, who might find reminders of servants her own age depressing. By September, Robert had made his decision and began implementation. The specifics of what happened that fall aren't documented in detail. The historical record provides only outcomes. By December 1834, the young woman was visibly pregnant. The plantation ledgers note no explanation, no incident reports, nothing to indicate how or why this occurred. She simply appeared one day with the undeniable evidence of pregnancy, and the household staff adjusted accordingly. She was moved from the main house to a small cabin at the plantation's far edge, normally used for storing tools during winter. The official explanation, given to the overseer and others who might question, was that she'd been compromised by one of the field workers and was being isolated to prevent moral contamination of the other house servants. Such situations occurred occasionally on plantations, handled with varying degrees of cruelty or indifference depending on the owner's temperament. The cabin was 15 feet square, with a dirt floor, a small fireplace, one window, and a door that could be locked from outside. Minimal furniture: a straw-stuffed mattress on a wooden frame, a stool, a bucket for water, another for waste. It was marginally better than the field workers' cabins. She had the space to herself rather than sharing with a family. But it was isolation, imprisonment disguised as pregnancy accommodation. She lived there through the winter, attended occasionally by the plantation's midwife, brought meals twice daily by a woman from the kitchens who was forbidden to speak with her beyond necessary communication. No one visited otherwise. She was invisible, existing in a space literally at the edge of the plantation's social geography, neither part of the household nor the field community. The baby was born in May 1835. The midwife's name was Rachel, age 53, who'd been delivering babies on the plantation for 30 years. She'd brought 2 generations into the world, including Robert himself, though she never reminded him of this fact. Her position gave her marginal privileges: a private cabin, lighter work duties as she aged, some respect from the community she served. She used these privileges carefully, never overstepping, always aware that even her specialized skills didn't make her truly safe. When Robert summoned her to the isolated cabin in early May 1835, she knew immediately this wasn't an ordinary birth. The setup, the location, the secrecy, none of it followed normal patterns. She'd attended hundreds of births across all the various complications of plantation life, legitimate marriages, casual encounters, coerced situations, everything that happened when power was absolute and people were property. But this felt different. The labor lasted 14 hours. Not unusual for a first child, though the mother's young age and evident terror made everything harder. She barely spoke, answering Rachel's questions with single words or nods, her eyes fixed on the cabin ceiling, as if looking at Rachel would make everything more real. Rachel had seen this before too, the dissociation that came when women couldn't bear to be present in their own bodies. The baby arrived at dawn, a healthy boy weighing perhaps 7 pounds, with a strong cry and no immediate complications. Rachel cleaned him efficiently, checking for the usual problems. Breathing, color, reflexes, malformations. Everything appeared normal. More than normal. He was a beautiful baby, the kind that made you smile despite circumstances. And he was unmistakably white. Light skin, thin features, hair that would probably lighten to brown or blonde. If you'd shown Rachel this baby in church and told her he belonged to any of the county's white families, she'd have believed you without question. That's when she understood exactly what was happening and what her role would be. She placed the baby in his mother's arms. The young woman, 18 and just having endured her first childbirth, looked down at the infant with an expression Rachel would remember decades later as the saddest thing I ever witnessed. Not rejection, not even the complicated resentment that sometimes appeared in births that resulted from violence. Just profound, absolute sadness, as if she could see the future and knew exactly how this story would end. He's healthy, Rachel said quietly, because someone needed to speak. Strong. He'll do well. The woman said nothing, just held the baby for those first few minutes, studying his face like she was memorizing it. Rachel left them alone and went to report to Robert, who'd been waiting at the main house. She found him in his study, ledgers spread across his desk, pen in hand. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his eyes that he'd been planning this moment for months. "Well?" he asked. "Healthy boy," Rachel reported. "No complications." And the appearance? There it was, the question that confirmed everything. Rachel had been practicing her answer, keeping her voice neutral, professional. Light-complected. Features are acceptable. Robert smiled, genuine pleasure crossing his face. "Excellent. Bring him to the house tomorrow evening after dark. There's a gentleman arriving from Richmond who'll handle the arrangements." Rachel nodded and left without further questions, returning to the cabin where the young mother was nursing the baby for what Rachel suspected would be the first and last time. The next 3 days followed a pattern that would repeat 17 more times over the following years. The baby stayed with his mother, nursed when hungry, slept in her arms. She spoke to him constantly in those 72 hours. Rachel heard fragments when she came to check on them. Not baby talk, but real conversation, as if explaining the world to someone who could understand. Apologies mostly. Promises that she would have kept him if she could. Explanations about choices that weren't really choices. On the 4th day, Robert came personally, accompanied by a man Rachel had never seen before. Middle-aged, well-dressed in a Richmond style, carrying a leather satchel. They entered the cabin while Rachel waited outside, her back turned, trying not to hear. The woman screamed once, just once, a sound that cut off abruptly as if someone had physically silenced her, then quiet voices. Robert's, calm and instructional, the stranger's businesslike, the woman's no longer audible. Rachel heard paper rustling, documents being reviewed, signed, then footsteps, and the stranger emerged carrying a bundle of blankets with the baby inside. He walked past Rachel without acknowledging her, heading toward a carriage waiting near the main house. Robert followed a moment later, pausing to speak to Rachel. "She'll need a few days to recover. Continue attending her. Regular meals, basic care. She'll return to work within the week." Then he too left, and Rachel stood alone outside the cabin, listening to the absolute silence from within. She waited 10 minutes before entering. The young woman sat on the mattress, staring at her empty arms, tears streaming silently down her face. No sound, no sobbing, just tears and that terrible silence. Rachel sat beside her and did the only thing she could. She waited, present but not intrusive, until the tears eventually stopped and the woman lay down, curling into herself, still silent. Rachel stayed until dark, then returned to her own cabin, where she lit a candle and began writing in the diary she'd kept secretly for years, hidden under a floorboard and written in the careful hand she'd taught herself late in life. The entry for May 6, 1835 was brief. Delivered a boy. Healthy. They took him. God witness what I've seen. The woman returned to work within a week, reassigned to the laundry house, where heavy physical labor would rebuild her strength. She moved mechanically through tasks, speaking only when necessary, eating little, sleeping poorly based on the reports Rachel heard from others. The household staff knew, of course. You couldn't hide pregnancy and sudden childlessness from people who lived in close quarters, but no one spoke about it directly. Such conversations were dangerous. Margaret, sedated in her upstairs rooms, knew nothing, or if she suspected, the laudanum made it easy not to think about uncomfortable possibilities. The baby appeared in the Richmond Foundling Home's records that same week. Male infant, approximately 4 days old, healthy, left with substantial donation from anonymous benefactor. The home's director, a practical woman who managed on perpetually inadequate funding, asked no questions about the baby's origins. Anonymous donations were common enough, and this one came with $50, 6 months of operating costs for the home. The baby stayed at the Foundling Home exactly 3 weeks. In early June, a prosperous merchant family, the Harrisons, visited looking to adopt. They'd been married 15 years without children, owned a successful dry goods business, and wanted a son to eventually inherit. The Foundling Home director showed them several infants, but the Harrisons were immediately drawn to the newest arrival. He was perfect, healthy, beautiful, unmistakably white, young enough to bond completely with adoptive parents. The adoption was finalized within days. Papers were signed, fees paid, and the baby departed to his new life as Thomas Harrison, beloved son of Edward and Catherine Harrison of Richmond, Virginia. He would grow up in comfort, receive excellent education, eventually inherit his father's business, marry well, and father 4 children of his own. He would die in 1897 at age 62, a respected member of Richmond society, never knowing anything about his birth beyond what his parents told him, that he'd been a foundling, chosen specially by parents who wanted him desperately. Back at the Hartley plantation, life returned to its normal rhythms. The woman worked in the laundry house, hauling water and scrubbing clothes in huge copper kettles, the physical labor demanding enough to exhaust her into dreamless sleep each night. Robert reviewed his accounts and confirmed the arrangement had worked perfectly. The Richmond intermediary had charged 20% commission, but even after expenses, Robert had netted over $200, more than a year's profit from tobacco at current market rates. More importantly, he'd proven the concept. It could work. It had worked, and nothing prevented him from repeating it. By September 1835, the woman was pregnant again. The second pregnancy confirmed Robert's system was viable. This time there was no pretense about field workers or moral failing. The household staff understood exactly what was happening. The woman was isolated again, attended by Rachel, and kept away from areas where Margaret or visitors might see her. Robert refined his procedures with each cycle. He established regular contact with 3 different Richmond intermediaries, rotating among them to avoid establishing too clear a pattern with any single one. He learned which foundling homes asked the fewest questions and which families were most likely to adopt quickly without investigation. He developed documentation systems that tracked each child's characteristics, placement location, and payment received, while never explicitly stating what the entries actually meant. The ledger became his private record, kept locked in his study's concealed drawer, never shown to anyone else. Each entry followed the same format. Date of birth, physical description using coded language, excellent, satisfactory, requires careful placement. Location, Richmond, Norfolk, Petersburg, occasionally more distant cities, and a notation that corresponded to financial entries elsewhere in the plantation accounts. The second child, a boy born March 1836, went to a Norfolk family desperate for an heir after 3 daughters. The third, a girl, January 1837, was placed with a Petersburg couple who'd lost their only child to yellow fever. The fourth, another boy, October 1837, went to a Richmond widow who wanted to ensure her late husband's property stayed in the family. Each placement brought between $150 and $300, sometimes more if the family was particularly wealthy and desperate. By the time the fifth child was born in August 1838, Robert's financial situation had stabilized completely. The payments from child placements generated more reliable income than tobacco, required no overhead beyond what he was already spending on the woman's maintenance, and operated entirely off the books where creditors and tax collectors couldn't touch it. He paid down debts, made deferred repairs on the plantation, upgraded equipment, and even began hosting the social functions that his position demanded. Neighbors saw a successful young planter who'd weathered difficult years through prudent management. No one suspected the source of his recovered prosperity. Margaret remained isolated in her laudanum haze, increasingly disconnected from household operations. On her better days, she managed to come downstairs for dinner, participate minimally in church services, even host occasional afternoon teas for neighboring wives. But mostly she existed in her darkened bedroom, attended by patients who now understood far more than she wanted to about her employer's activities, but was trapped by her own enslaved status into silence. Patients struggled with terrible moral conflict during these years. Her Christian beliefs taught that slavery itself was ordained by God, that servants should obey masters, that hierarchy reflected divine order. But those same beliefs taught that children were sacred, that mothers deserved protection, that exploitation of the vulnerable was sin. She couldn't reconcile what she witnessed with what she believed, so she did what thousands of enslaved people did daily. She survived by fragmenting her conscience, finding ways to live with contradictions that might otherwise destroy her sanity. She was kind to the young woman on the rare occasions their paths crossed, offering small gestures, extra food, a sympathetic look, once even a whispered "God sees your suffering," that were all she dared risk. She prayed constantly, begging forgiveness for her complicity, asking God to intervene, knowing he wouldn't because he never did in situations like this. The plantation's other residents developed their own strategies for coping with the knowledge. Some convinced themselves it wasn't really happening, that the pregnancies had ordinary explanations. Others acknowledged it internally, but never spoke about it, understanding that discussing matters involving the master was dangerous. A few actively approved, seeing the woman as somehow fortunate that Robert had chosen her for this role rather than treating her worse, or finding ways to justify anything that kept the plantation economically stable and all of them marginally safer. Human societies are expert at normalizing atrocity when resisting it carries unacceptable costs. Rachel, attending each birth, keeping her secret diary, struggled most of all. Her role made her directly complicit. She delivered these babies knowing they'd be taken away, cared for them in their brief hours with their mother, then watched them disappear forever. She couldn't refuse Robert's orders without risking her own safety and losing the marginal privileges that made her aging bearable. So she continued, making the only moral choice available. She documented everything, writing detailed entries about each birth, each child's appearance, each mother's reaction, creating a historical record that might someday serve as testimony, even if it was currently powerless to stop what was happening. The sixth child arrived in June 1839, the seventh in March 1840, the eighth in January 1841. By now the routine was mechanical. Isolation during pregnancy, attended birth, 3 days together, removal, recovery, return to work. Repeat. The woman, still unnamed in most records, still designated only by category and initial, endured each cycle with increasingly visible emotional devastation. Rachel's diary entries from this period noted her deteriorating mental state. "She doesn't speak anymore," read one entry. "Won't meet anyone's eyes," stated another. Moved through labor like she wasn't present in her own body, described a third. But her physical resilience remained remarkable. Despite repeated pregnancies and the physical toll they took, she survived, recovered, continued. Robert tracked this too, noting in his private ledger which children were born more easily, which deliveries caused complications, adjusting his timing to allow adequate recovery while maximizing production. He approached it like livestock breeding, calculating optimal intervals between pregnancies to maintain the woman's viability as long as possible. The 9th child, born in late 1841, marked a subtle shift in the pattern. Rachel's diary noted, "The baby came quickly, healthy boy, but she didn't cry this time. Didn't speak to him either. Just held him and stared, like she'd already left her body." Something had broken in the woman, some capacity for emotional response that had sustained her through previous births. Robert noticed this too, though his concern was purely practical. A woman too damaged to cooperate could become a problem. He instructed Rachel to ensure she received adequate food and rest, even assigned lighter work duties temporarily, treating her like valuable equipment that needed maintenance to continue functioning. The 10th child arrived in August 1842, the 11th in June 1843, the 12th in March 1844. By now, the woman was 33 years old and had been enduring this pattern for 9 years. The physical toll was becoming visible: premature aging, chronic health problems, the accumulated damage of 12 pregnancies and childbirths with only basic medical attention. Rachel's entries grew increasingly worried. "She's getting weaker. This birth was difficult. I don't know how many more times her body can do this." But the financial incentive remained compelling. Robert's plantation was now among the most prosperous in the county, his credit restored, his social position secure. He'd married off 2 of his younger sisters to well-placed men, using generous dowries that the tobacco business alone couldn't have funded. He'd purchased additional land, expanded operations, built a new tobacco barn, all funded partially through legitimate business and partially through the invisible income generated by a woman in a distant cabin who gave birth to children that didn't exist in any official accounting. The 13th child, born in January 1845, finally represented a setback. The baby was a girl, but her skin tone was slightly darker than Robert preferred, and her features were less clearly European. She stayed at the foundling home for 5 months before a placement could be arranged. And even then, the adopting family was less prestigious, a rural farming couple rather than urban merchants or professionals. Robert's payment reflected this, only $75 instead of his usual $200 to $300. The ledger entry for this child was annotated with unusual detail. Placement difficult, features less satisfactory, pricing reduced, must ensure future products meet standards. The dehumanization was complete. He'd stopped thinking of these babies as children and saw them purely as commodities whose value depended on appearance. Margaret died that spring, her system finally succumbing to years of laudanum dependency. She simply didn't wake one morning, her heart quietly stopping during sleep. The doctor listed heart failure due to nervous exhaustion, which was accurate enough. She was 30 years old but looked 50. Used up by grief, medication, and willful ignorance about her household's realities. Robert observed appropriate mourning, 6 months of reduced social activity, black clothing, subdued demeanor. Then he began courting Eleanor, a 43-year-old widow from North Carolina whose husband had died the previous year. Eleanor had no illusions about romance. She wanted financial security and household authority, and Robert wanted a respectable wife who wouldn't ask difficult questions. They married in November 1845, 6 months after Margaret's death, and Eleanor assumed management of the household with brisk efficiency. Eleanor was no fool. Within weeks, she'd understood exactly what was happening on the plantation, but she was also practical, and in her way, morally flexible. She'd grown up in the plantation system, had managed enslaved workers her entire adult life, and had long ago made peace with the moral compromises required for comfort and security. If Robert had found an innovative income source, that was his business. Her job was managing the household, not questioning her husband's methods. She did insist on certain boundaries. She never wanted to see the woman, never wanted to hear details, never wanted the situation acknowledged in her presence. As long as Robert kept it completely separate from household operations and social life, Eleanor would ignore it. This suited Robert perfectly. Eleanor was far more useful as a partner than Margaret had ever been. The pregnancies continued. The 14th child in September 1846, the 15th in July 1847, the 16th in May 1848. The woman was now 37 years old, had been enduring this pattern for 13 years, and was clearly deteriorating. Rachel's diary entries from this period are increasingly distressed. She's so thin. The bleeding won't stop. I truly believe the next birth will kill her. Yet she continued to survive, displaying the kind of profound resilience that speaks either to remarkable physical constitution or to the human body's terrible ability to endure unendurable circumstances, because death won't come, despite being preferable. Robert was now 60 years old, still physically vigorous, but aware he was aging. His father had finally died in 1847, releasing him from the grim duty of managing an invalid. Several of his children, the legitimate adoptees he'd placed, had grown into successful young adults, though of course he could never acknowledge them publicly. He'd tracked their progress when possible, confirming his genetic legacy thrived in multiple households across Virginia and beyond. The 17th child was born in March 1849 and marked another milestone. It was the first time the woman actively resisted. According to Rachel's diary, when Robert came to take the baby on the third day, the woman refused to hand the child over. She'd held the infant, a boy, and simply said no. Robert had expected this eventually. He'd brought the overseer with him, and between them they physically pried the baby from her arms while she fought silently. No screaming, just desperate physical resistance that ended when the overseer struck her hard enough to daze her. They took the baby and left her bleeding from a split lip, curled on the mattress, making a low, keening sound that Rachel described as less than human and more than human at once. That resistance earned her 3 days locked in the cabin without food, a punishment for disobedience. When Rachel was finally allowed to bring her food and check on her, she found the woman alive, but utterly broken, sitting in her own waste, staring at nothing. I thought that was the end, Rachel wrote in her diary. I thought she would die, either from her body giving out or from her spirit finally breaking completely. But she didn't die. She just continued, like a clock that keeps ticking even after the clockmaker has abandoned it. The woman returned to work eventually, thinner and more silent than ever, moving through assigned tasks mechanically. The household staff whispered that she'd gone mad, and perhaps in some sense she had. But she continued to function, to survive, to endure. Because the pattern wasn't finished yet. There was still one more child to come. The 18th pregnancy began in the late summer of 1855. The woman was 44 years old, exceptionally old for pregnancy even in ideal circumstances, dangerously old given her medical history and accumulated physical damage. When Rachel confirmed the pregnancy in September, she went directly to Robert and begged him to terminate it, explaining that continuation would almost certainly kill the woman and might produce a stillborn or deformed child anyway. Robert refused. This would be the last child. Even he understood that continuing beyond this point was impossible. But he wanted that final product. The woman would likely die regardless at this point, worn out from years of use. Better to extract one more child who might be valuable than to simply let her deteriorate without purpose. His calculation was purely economic. The woman represented sunk costs at this point. Her useful life was ending whether he continued or not. But a healthy white infant could still bring $200 or $300. From a business perspective, attempting one final pregnancy made sense even if it killed her, because she had minimal remaining value otherwise. The pregnancy progressed with terrible difficulty from the start. Severe morning sickness that lasted throughout, not just the first months. Dangerous swelling in her extremities. Chronic pain that left her unable to work for weeks at a time. Rachel's diary entries became increasingly desperate, describing a woman whose body was actively failing. She can't keep food down. The swelling is so severe her skin is cracking. She has fever that won't break. In March 1856, 3 months before the baby's due date, Rachel went to Robert again, this time bringing Eleanor with her. Together they argued that the situation was medically dangerous, that continuing risked not just the woman's life, but potentially a stillborn child, and that common sense dictated terminating the pregnancy. Eleanor, practical as always, framed it in financial terms. A dead mother and dead baby represented total loss, while terminating now at least preserved. Well, she trailed off, because there really wasn't anything to preserve at this point. Robert heard them out, then refused again. They were too close to completion. The baby might survive even if the mother didn't, and that would be sufficient. 3 more months. Those final months were torment that Rachel documented in clinical detail. The woman was confined to the cabin permanently, too weak to move more than a few feet. She developed bed sores from constant lying down. Her breathing became labored. The baby inside her continued to grow, draining what little resources her body had remaining. In late May, the woman went into early labor. The baby was coming 6 weeks premature, not ideal but possibly viable if delivery went smoothly. Rachel moved into the cabin, preparing for what she knew would be the most difficult birth she'd ever attended. The labor lasted 42 hours. This wasn't medical necessity. The baby was small enough and positioned correctly. It was simply that the woman's body had been so damaged by 18 pregnancies that it could barely perform the basic functions of childbirth. Contractions were weak and irregular. Hours passed between meaningful progress. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, too exhausted to push effectively. Her body attempting to complete a process it no longer had strength for. Rachel stayed throughout, doing everything she could with her limited tools and knowledge. She gave herbs to strengthen contractions, applied pressure to guide the baby, talked constantly to keep the woman conscious and focused. She sent for help. 2 other women experienced with childbirth came to assist, bringing clean cloths and water and extra hands. The baby finally came at dawn on June 4, 1856. A girl, tiny but alive, weighing perhaps 4 pounds. Her cry was weak but present. Rachel worked frantically to clear her airways, warm her, stimulate breathing. The baby lived, barely, but she lived. Behind her, the mother was dying, hemorrhaging severely, unable to deliver the afterbirth. Her body simply giving up after 18 births and 42 hours of final labor. Rachel turned from the baby to try to save the mother, but there was nothing to be done. The bleeding was too severe, internal damage too extensive. The woman died within 20 minutes of her daughter's birth, never having held the baby, never having spoken a final word, simply bleeding out on a straw mattress in a cabin at the edge of a plantation in Virginia. Rachel held the tiny baby and looked at the dead mother and experienced something like despair. 18 children, 18 births attended, 18 babies taken away. And now this. The mother dead, an infant so premature she might not survive the week. And for what? Money. The whole monstrous arrangement had been for money. She wrapped the baby carefully and carried her to the main house, where she found Robert already awake and waiting for news. She reported clinically. The mother was dead, the baby was alive but very premature and fragile. Survival was uncertain. Robert looked at the tiny infant, studying her features with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated 17 previous children. And what he saw gave him pause. This baby looked exactly like him. Not just the general European features he'd been producing, this child had his specific face stamped in miniature. The distinctive Hartley nose, the particular shape of the eyes, the chin's exact contour. Anyone who knew him and saw this child would recognize the resemblance immediately. For the first time, Robert's cold calculation faltered. This wasn't a safely anonymous product he could place with distant strangers. This was unmistakably his daughter, and keeping her or placing her would both carry dangerous implications. What if she ended up in Richmond, where his associates might see her? What if she was shown to families who knew the Hartley name and recognized the resemblance? What if, years later, questions arose? He sent Rachel away with instructions to care for the baby and tell him if she survived the next few days. Then he sat in his study, staring at the ledger that documented 18 years of systematic exploitation, and finally recognized he'd gone too far. The baby lived for 3 days, nursed by Rachel with milk from the plantation's one nursing mother who'd recently given birth. The tiny girl took milk weekly, slept most of the time, and on the evening of June 7th, simply stopped breathing. Infant mortality was common enough that her death surprised no one. Robert had the baby buried without ceremony in the plantation's designated area, next to her mother who'd been interred days earlier. No markers identified either grave. They simply disappeared into the earth, anonymous even in death. For the first time in 18 years, Robert felt something like guilt. Not for the exploitation itself. He'd made peace with that years ago, but for the dangerous exposure the final child represented. He'd been lucky she died. If she'd survived, if he'd been forced to either keep her or place her knowing the resemblance could expose everything, the entire arrangement could have unraveled. The ledger sat in his study, documenting his crimes in neat handwriting. He should have destroyed it years ago, but he'd kept it as private record of his accomplishment, proof of his cleverness in finding an invisible income source. Now it represented evidence, a detailed confession written in his own hand. In September 1856, Robert attempted to destroy the evidence. He burned documents from the cabin where the woman had lived, destroyed correspondence with Richmond intermediaries, found and burned contracts and payments records that might connect him to the child placements. He worked through the night, feeding his fireplace, watching paper curl and blacken, trying to erase history. But he kept the ledger, perhaps from vanity, perhaps from inability to let go of documentation of his ingenuity, perhaps simply because destroying it felt like admitting wrongdoing rather than just covering tracks. He hid it more carefully, built a concealed compartment in his study's wall, and told himself it was safe enough. The plantation should have returned to normal operations. The woman was dead. The arrangement was over. Robert could focus on standard plantation business in his remaining years. Instead, everything began to fall apart. The fires started in November 1856, 5 months after the woman's death. The first destroyed a tobacco barn containing that season's harvest, hundreds of pounds of cured tobacco ready for market, gone in an inferno that lit up the night sky. The next morning, investigating the ruins, the overseer found no obvious cause. No lightning strike, no discarded pipe, no evidence of accidental ignition. Just a thorough, efficient fire that consumed everything. Robert absorbed the financial loss. He had reserves by this point, and increased security. The overseer posted watchers, instituted evening patrols, tried to establish who'd been where when the fire started. But the plantation's geography made surveillance difficult. 200 acres, dozens of buildings, 200 residents. Someone determined to cause damage could find opportunities. The second fire came in December, taking out the stables. 3 horses died, including Robert's favorite riding horse. This fire was also inexplicable. It started after midnight when the stable was locked and secured, spread too quickly to be accidental, and showed signs of deliberate ignition based on the burn patterns. January brought the third fire, this one damaging the main house's east wing. Only quick action by household staff prevented it from spreading to the entire structure, and even so, 2 bedrooms were destroyed and smoke damage affected much of the upper floor. Eleanor, who'd been sleeping in the west wing, was shaken enough to demand explanations Robert couldn't provide. The pattern was undeniable. Someone was systematically destroying plantation infrastructure. The question was who and why. Robert interrogated servants, field workers, everyone he could identify who might have grievance or opportunity. The overseer used violence, trying to extract confessions. No one admitted anything. The fires continued, supplemented now by other sabotages. Tools breaking mysteriously, supplies spoiling, fences collapsing, livestock escaping or dying from unexplained causes. The plantation's operations deteriorated. Field work suffered as workers were pulled for security duty. Expenses mounted as Robert replaced damaged equipment and buildings. The overseer, frustrated and frightened, became increasingly brutal, which only made the remaining workers less cooperative. A cycle of violence and resistance developed that made the situation progressively worse. By March 1857, Robert's financial reserves were depleting. The tobacco business had been mediocre for years anyway, sustained only by the secret income from child placements. Now, with that revenue ended and sabotage destroying property faster than tobacco could fund repairs, he faced the prospect of actual bankruptcy. Eleanor had a stroke in April, milder than what had afflicted Robert's father, but enough to leave her right side weakened and her role as household manager compromised. She needed constant care, which meant additional servants pulled from other duties, further disrupting operations. The plantation was collapsing, and Robert couldn't understand why. He'd treated his workers no worse than any other planter. Yes, he'd used one woman for his purposes, but that was hardly unusual. Such arrangements occurred on plantations throughout the South. Why was his workforce now in open, if undeclared, rebellion? What Robert didn't understand, what he couldn't understand from his position of absolute power, was that the woman in the distant cabin had been visible to her community in ways he'd never noticed. The other enslaved people had known her before her years of isolation. They'd watched 18 pregnancies. They'd known when babies disappeared. They'd understood exactly what was happening and had been powerless to stop it while she lived. But now she was dead, and the covenant that bound them to compliance, the desperate hope that cooperation might bring marginal safety, had dissolved. Robert had demonstrated that cooperation meant nothing. Compliance guaranteed nothing. She'd given him 18 children and died for the effort, receiving no protection, no mercy, nothing but exploitation until her body finally failed. If cooperation brought no safety, then why cooperate? The fires, the sabotages, the small resistances, these weren't organized rebellion in any formal sense. There was no conspiracy, no planning meetings, no identified leadership. Instead, it was spontaneous, distributed resistance. Individuals and small groups independently deciding they'd reached limits and beginning to push back in whatever ways they could, without obvious exposure. A fire here, a broken tool there, livestock accidentally released, supplies carelessly allowed to spoil. None of it traceable to specific individuals, all of it adding up to systematic destruction of the plantation's operational capacity. Robert tried everything to restore order. He increased punishments, offered rewards for information, made speeches about shared interests and appropriate behavior. Nothing worked. The plantation's workforce had collectively, silently decided that his authority no longer held force, and there was nothing he could do to restore it without violence so extreme it would destroy the labor force he needed. In June 1857, Eleanor died, officially from complications of her stroke, though timing suggested possibly more sinister causes. Unexplained deaths occurred on plantations. Poisons were available to those who worked in kitchens and new plants. Proving cause of death was nearly impossible with 1850s medical knowledge. Eleanor simply weakened over several days and died, and the doctor saw nothing definitively suspicious, even if he had private suspicions. Robert was alone now, 61 years old, managing a collapsing operation, increasingly paranoid and isolated. His father was dead. Both wives were dead. He had no acknowledged children, and the plantation that represented 3 generations of family legacy was disintegrating around him. He spent more and more time in his study, drinking heavily, reviewing ledgers that documented his various failures and crimes. The secret ledger came out of its hiding place, and he spent long nights reading through 18 years of entries, 18 children's brief existence documented in business-like notation. What had he accomplished? Financial security that was now evaporating. Social position that meant nothing if the plantation failed. A genetic legacy scattered across Virginia in children who'd never know his name, and one woman dead at 44, used up completely, buried without a marker in ground he'd owned. Had it been worth it? The question haunted him in those long night hours. By any practical calculation, yes. He'd generated substantial income, weathered financial crisis, maintained his position. But something about the final child's death, or the woman's silent endurance through 18 births, or perhaps just the accumulation of consequences now destroying everything he'd built, made him question whether cleverness and success were the same thing. The final ledger entry was written in September 1857 during one of these drinking sessions. His handwriting, normally precise, shook across the page. Burned it all. God forgive me. He had tried to burn the evidence, though incompletely. He destroyed the cabin where everything had happened, watching it burn and feeling something like catharsis. He'd found and burned other documents, letters, records. But he kept the ledger, unable to destroy the final testimony to what he'd accomplished. The plantation records show increasing disorder through September 1857. Entries became erratic. Calculations didn't balance. Paranoid notes appeared in margins. Robert was deteriorating mentally, his world collapsing, his certainties dissolved. He died on October 15, 1857, found at his desk by the manservant who brought morning coffee. Heart failure, the doctor ruled, which was true in the medical sense. His heart had stopped. Whether from natural causes, poison, or simply the body giving up under stress and alcohol abuse, no autopsy was performed to determine. Robert was buried in the family plot with appropriate ceremony, eulogized as a respected planter who'd maintained family legacy through difficult times. The minister who delivered the eulogy was the same man who'd visited the woman in her cabin years earlier and witnessed her suffering. He spoke about Robert's life, his accomplishments, his standing in the community. He did not mention that every word tasted like ash in his mouth. The plantation passed to a distant cousin, who arrived to find operations in complete chaos. 60 of the 200 enslaved workers had already escaped, taking advantage of the disorder to flee north. Those remaining were openly hostile, refusing direct orders, doing minimal work, clearly waiting for opportunity to leave or for the plantation to fail completely. The cousin tried for 2 years to restore functionality, failed, and sold the property in 1859 to a consortium that broke it up. The various parcels were divided, some sold to neighboring planters, others to investors from Richmond. The enslaved people were sold separately or escaped before sales could be finalized. When the Civil War came in 1861, the former Hartley Plantation was barely recognizable as such. The main house stood empty, vandalized by passing soldiers from both armies. The fields had gone fallow, overtaken by weeds. The cabins where 200 people had lived were collapsing, roofs fallen in, walls rotting. After the war, during Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people scattered. Some stayed in Virginia, working as sharecroppers or moving to cities. Others headed north to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, anywhere that offered possibility of new lives. They carried their memories with them, stories about the places they'd been enslaved. But many of those stories died with them, never written down, never formally preserved. Rachel ended up in Philadelphia, working at a colored hospital that served freed people. She was in her 70s by then, her midwifery years behind her. But she had experience with illness and dying, which was valuable in the chaotic post-war years when thousands of freed people were flooding north, many sick or injured or traumatized. It was in Philadelphia in 1889, approaching 85 and knowing she was dying, that Rachel finally decided her diary needed to become public testimony. She'd kept it secret for 40 years, hidden and private, documentation of horrors she'd witnessed but couldn't prevent. Now, with her life ending and slavery itself officially abolished, she sent the diary to an abolitionist newspaper that still published. The paper ran excerpts over 3 issues in the fall of 1889. The response was mixed. Some readers were horrified, demanding investigations. Others dismissed it as exaggerated or falsified anti-Southern propaganda. A few argued that, even if true, it described practices that were now illegal and thus irrelevant to current conditions. The minister who'd known the Hartley Plantation also published his memoirs in the 1890s, including careful descriptions of what he'd witnessed there. He was vaguer than Rachel. He'd seen less and understood less, but his testimony corroborated key elements of her account. Academic historians began investigating in the early 1900s, cross-referencing Rachel's diary with plantation records, church documents, county records, foundling home logs. The pattern emerged gradually. 18 children, 1 woman, systematic exploitation over nearly 20 years. The Hartley Plantation ledger surfaced in 1931, discovered in an estate collection being processed by a university archive. The graduate student who found it recognized immediately that the coded entries corresponded to Rachel's descriptions. Combined documentation finally proved definitively what had happened. The dates matched, the numbers aligned, the system Rachel had described was confirmed by Robert's own meticulous records. Genealogical research began in earnest in the 1940s, trying to trace the 18 children. 12 were identified through various records. Birth dates matching foundling home admissions, adoption records, marriage and death certificates, census data. The researchers built family trees, showing that these 12 children had lived ordinary lives, married, had children of their own, died peacefully decades later. Their descendants, and by the 1940s there were dozens, mostly had no idea about their ancestry. A few families, contacted carefully by researchers, were shocked to learn their respected grandparents or great-grandparents had been born into circumstances they'd never imagined. Some embraced the historical truth, recognizing it explained family mysteries. Others rejected it entirely, insisting researchers were mistaken or malicious. The 6 untraced children simply disappeared into history's vast anonymity. They may have died young, been poorly documented, or successfully hidden their origins so completely that no documentary trail survived. As for the woman herself, the one who'd endured everything, the one whose body had produced 18 children, the one who died at 44 in a cabin at Plantation's edge, her identification remained uncertain. Rachel's diary called her S, suggesting Sarah. Plantation ledgers used various designations but never a full name. The 1850 census listed an unnamed woman of appropriate age and category. In the 1940s, researchers found one promising lead, a man in Detroit whose grandmother had escaped Virginia during the Civil War and told stories about a woman on the Hartley Plantation named Sarah, who carried her grief quiet and her rage quieter. But third-hand testimony across 80 years couldn't constitute proof, and no confirming documentation ever emerged. Sarah, if that was her name, remained as anonymous in history as she'd been forced to be in life. Her grave, unmarked and unrecorded, was somewhere on property that had been subdivided and redeveloped multiple times since 1857. Nothing physical remained. The academic papers published in the 1950s and 60s analyzed various aspects of the case. Economists studied the illegal adoption market's functioning. Medical historians examined the implications of 18 pregnancies with 19th-century medical care. Psychologists considered the trauma's effects. Legal scholars debated whether any retroactive prosecution could be attempted. The case became a footnote in slavery histories, notable for its systematic nature and unusual documentation, but certain questions remained unanswered. The fires and sabotages of 1856-57, were they coordinated revenge or coincidence? Did the enslaved community deliberately destroy Robert's operations in response to Sarah's death? The timing was suggestive, the results clear, but proof remained elusive. Some historians argued yes, the pattern was too deliberate to be accidental, the timing too precise. Others countered that attributing it to coordination might romanticize resistance in ways that imposed modern perspectives on historical actors who faced impossible constraints. Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps what mattered was that Sarah endured, survived as long as possible, and that after her death, the system collapsed. Whether through deliberate action, spontaneous resistance, or simply the accumulated weight of exploitation finally exceeding what structure could bear. The plantation that had consumed her couldn't sustain itself after her death. The Hartley Plantation site is now a shopping center in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. A historical marker mentions it was once a tobacco plantation operated by the Hartley family, from 1768-1859, notes it was seized during the Civil War, and describes its later development. Nothing on the marker suggests the darker history beneath the parking lot's asphalt. The ledger resides in a university archive's climate-controlled vault, available to researchers by appointment. The pages are fragile, the ink fading, but Robert's handwriting remains legible. 18 entries documenting 18 children, each born to a woman whose name he never recorded, each taken away 3 days after birth, each representing a sum of money and a small piece of his genetic legacy scattered across Virginia. Rachel's diary is preserved in a different collection, her later pages marked by shaking handwriting and occasional smudges that might be tear stains. She'd written knowing her testimony might be the only justice Sarah ever received, the only acknowledgement that her suffering had been witnessed and mattered. The woman herself, Sarah, remains a gap in history, a person reduced to an initial in someone's ledger, her humanity stripped so completely that even recovering her name became impossible. She lived, endured, bore 18 children into a world that would never acknowledge her as their mother, and died at 44, buried without marker or ceremony. The 18 children lived their lives, raised families, died without knowing they'd been commodities before they were people. Their descendants walk through the world today as ordinary Americans with normal family stories, unaware that their existences resulted from systematic exploitation, that their ancestral mother died nameless and exhausted, used up entirely for profit. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect, how thoroughly someone could be erased, how slavery's machinery could consume a person completely, leaving only business records and ghostly children who never knew they had a mother whose name no one remembered to record. The archivists who maintain the ledger handle it carefully, wearing white gloves, supporting brittle pages. They show it to researchers, explaining context, pointing out significant entries. And every time they reach the final page where Robert, in his shaking hand, wrote, "Burned it all. God forgive me." But he didn't burn everything. The evidence survived. The truth remained, partial and painful, documented enough that Sarah's suffering couldn't be completely erased. She lived. She endured. She bore 18 children. And when she finally died, the system that had sustained itself on her body began to collapse. That's the story Plantation records reveal. Not just one man's crime, but society's complicity in turning human suffering into profit, and the unbearable question of what justice could mean when delivered a century too late to the person who needed it most. Some questions have no good answers. Some histories carry wounds that never fully heal. Some injustices are so profound that even acknowledgement, even full documentation, even teaching the truth to future generations can never constitute adequate response. Sarah's story is one of those. The ledger proves she existed, proves what happened to her, proves the 18 children she bore. But proof isn't justice. Documentation isn't restitution. Knowing the truth doesn't change that she died at 44, used up completely, buried without name or marker in ground that doesn't even exist as plantation land anymore. The only testimony to her existence is a ledger kept by the man who exploited her, diary entries from the woman who witnessed her suffering, and academic papers analyzing her case as historical data point. She left no words of her own, no direct testimony. Nothing but the biological legacy of children who never knew her and the negative space where her humanity should have been recorded. History is full of such absences, people whose lives mattered profoundly, but whose names and stories disappeared because the systems that oppressed them controlled the records. Sarah's story survived only because Robert was meticulous enough to document his crimes and Rachel was brave enough to testify despite risks. How many other stories didn't survive? How many other women endured similar exploitation without anyone recording it? Without even the minimal documentation that Robert's business calculations provided? How many children exist today with no idea their ancestors were born into circumstances like this? Those questions hang over the archive where the ledger rests, over the shopping center where the plantation once stood, over the entire historical record of American slavery. For every documented case like Sarah's, Dozens or hundreds or thousands of similar stories were lost completely, leaving no evidence beyond the children themselves, scattered, anonymous, unknowing. That's the final horror. Not just what happened to Sarah, but the recognition that her story survived only by accident, and that countless others like her disappeared so completely that we don't even know enough to ask about them. The ledger remains in its vault. Rachel's diary stays in its collection. Researchers continue analyzing, students continue studying, descendants continue discovering uncomfortable truths about their family histories. And somewhere in Spotsylvania County, beneath a parking lot where shoppers load groceries into their cars, Sarah lies in an unmarked grave next to her 18th child, both of them anonymous even in death, testimony to exploitation so systematic that only meticulous business records and one midwife's conscience kept them from disappearing entirely from history. That's the legacy. That's what the Plantation records reveal. That's the truth that survived Robert's attempt to burn it all. Sarah existed. She endured. She matters, even though the system that destroyed her tried to ensure she'd be forgotten. Her name was probably Sarah. She bore 18 children. She died at 44. And she will not be forgotten because some truths are too important to let disappear, no matter how thoroughly their perpetrators try to erase them.